It began with a document no one outside the palace was ever supposed to see. Deep inside Kensington Palace, Prince William reportedly rejected a series of secret amendments tied to the future of the monarchy, changes so controversial that even senior courtiers were left stunned. By dawn, security protocols had shifted, private aides were silenced, and whispers spread through royal corridors that a silent civil war had erupted inside the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made the situation even more chilling was not simply the existence of the amendments themselves, but the timing surrounding them. Reports suggest the late-night meeting took place during one of King Charles's increasingly fragile health periods, when senior palace officials were already operating under immense pressure behind closed doors. According to palace administrative whispers, Prince William had been summoned alongside constitutional advisors, royal legal experts, and a select group of senior staff shortly after midnight. No official record of the gathering was ever meant to surface publicly. Yet within hours, fragments of the story began leaking into media circles, and insiders immediately understood why the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace had shifted so dramatically overnight. Something extraordinary had happened. Those familiar with royal succession planning claimed the amendments centered on future authority structures once William eventually becomes king. On the surface, they reportedly appeared procedural small revisions buried beneath dense constitutional language. But various interpretations from insiders suggest the clauses carried consequences far larger than anyone initially admitted. Some allegedly expanded ceremonial influence for secondary royal households. Others reportedly altered advisory powers tied to succession oversight during periods of royal transition. My palace source described the language as deeply irregular, while another reportedly claimed the changes would have quietly reshaped the balance of influence inside the monarchy for decades to come. And according to whispers from within the palace legal office, William's reaction was immediate. The future king, often described publicly as measured and disciplined, allegedly became visibly furious as the implications unfolded in front of him. One insider claimed he stopped the meeting midway through review and demanded clarification on who authorized the revisions in the first place. Another source suggested several aides attempted to downplay the amendments as technical adjustments, but the explanation reportedly only intensified William's concern. Because within the context of royal constitutional planning, there are no minor changes. Every sentence carries historical weight. Every alteration echoes across generations. Princess Catherine, meanwhile, was reportedly the only common presence inside the room. Different interpretations of the meeting describe her urging restraint while William pressed for a full legal investigation into the origin of the clauses. Palace staff later noticed something deeply unusual. Several aides who normally coordinated public schedules suddenly disappeared from internal communications for nearly 24 hours. Security access around sensitive offices was reportedly tightened. Even long-serving staff members were instructed not to discuss the meeting, not with journalists, not with colleagues, and certainly not outside palace walls. The level of secrecy was unlike anything seen since the final months of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. But secrecy inside the monarchy rarely remains contained for long. By the following morning, royal correspondents had already begun noticing abrupt changes in palace routines. Scheduled appearances were quietly adjusted. Senior aides looked visibly strained during public engagements. Media insiders claimed there had been signs of internal instability for weeks, though few understood the scale of what was unfolding behind the scenes. And then came the most alarming whisper of all, that the rejected amendments were not merely administrative revisions, but part of a broader attempt to influence the monarchy's future after King Charles. That was the moment the situation transformed from a private constitutional dispute into something far more dangerous. Because according to those familiar with the palace's internal power structure, William no longer believed this was about paperwork. He believed it was about protecting the crown itself, and as more details slowly emerged from behind palace walls, it became increasingly clear that the rejected amendments were only the surface of a much deeper struggle, one tied to inheritance, loyalty, and a royal doctrine buried since the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Long before William's explosive rejection, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly left behind a constitutional framework designed to protect the monarchy from internal instability. And according to insiders, someone may have tried to quietly rewrite it. For decades, the late queen was said to operate with an almost unmatched understanding of royal continuity. Those who worked within the highest levels of palace administration often described her not simply as a monarch, but as the architect of survival itself. Through wars, scandals, divorces, abdications, and public outrage, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly built layers of constitutional protection around the crown systems designed to ensure that no moment of crisis could ever completely destabilize the institution she believed was sacred. That philosophy, whispered about for years inside royal circles, became known among some courtiers as the doctrine of the sacred trust. The monarchy, according to that belief, did not belong to individuals. It belonged to history, to duty, to continuity itself. And that is precisely why Professor Prince William allegedly viewed the secret amendments as something far more dangerous than ordinary administrative revisions. Because behind the grandeur of royal ceremonies exists an invisible machine of legal frameworks, succession documents, regency structures, sealed directives, and letters patent that quietly determine how power moves through the House of Windsor. These mechanisms rarely become public discussion. In fact, most remain deliberately buried beneath layers of constitutional tradition. Yet according to reports from palace insiders, it was within those hidden structures that the controversy began unfolding. Sources familiar with royal contingency planning claim several succession-related protocols had been revisited in recent months due to growing concerns surrounding King Charles's health. Since early 2024, the king's illness reportedly forced senior palace officials into accelerated preparations for multiple constitutional scenarios that Buckingham Palace had hoped to have discussing publicly for years. That urgency created opportunity, and according to various interpretations emerging from inside royal administrative circles, someone allegedly attempted to use that period of uncertainty to introduce subtle but deeply significant changes into the monarchy's future framework. The amendments reportedly touched areas tied to advisory authority, ceremonial influence, and long-term succession management once William ascends the throne. To the public, those phrases might sound technical, but within palace walls, they represent power itself. Influence over the monarchy has never rested solely in crowns or titles. It rests in access, in legal wording, in who controls the mechanisms surrounding the sovereign during moments of weakness and transition. And no institution reflects that reality more than the Duchy of Cornwall. The vast estate, worth over £1 billion according to recent estimates, is not merely a royal asset. It is the operational backbone of, by the heir to the throne. Control over the duchy grants not only financial independence but strategic influence inside the royal structure itself. Alongside regency frameworks and centuries-old letters patent issued under previous monarchs, it forms part of the constitutional architecture Queen Elizabeth reportedly spent decades protecting. Insiders now claim William saw the proposed amendments as a direct violation of that architecture, as if someone had attempted to alter the very blueprint his grandmother left behind. Royal historians have already begun drawing quiet comparisons to some of the monarchy's most dangerous succession crises, from the abdication turmoil of Edward VIII to internal fractures during Queen Victoria's later reign. Palace experts understand one truth better than anyone else. Uncertainty inside the line of succession creates instability everywhere else. And according to sources close to the palace, divisions are now growing sharper by the day. Senior officials regarding reportedly find themselves split between so-called modernizers who favor broader royal flexibility and traditionalists who believe the crown survives only through rigid constitutional discipline. That divide has allegedly created an atmosphere of fear inside the institution itself. Some insiders worry the monarchy could enter a period of internal fracture precisely at the moment it can least afford one. Because while the public still sees ceremony, stability, and royal tradition, those inside palace walls reportedly see something else entirely: a battle over the future, direction of the crown during one of the most fragile transitions in modern royal history. And according to palace whispers, one faction in particular stood to gain enormously if those amendments had survived. Sources close to royal administrative circles now claim the controversial revisions were not random edits, but part of a coordinated effort to shift influence inside the monarchy before William ascends the throne. What had initially been dismissed by some palace aides as procedural confusion was now evolving into something far more explosive. According to reports circulating among royal commentators and former household staff, the amendments allegedly carried fingerprints from advisors connected to competing royal interests figures who, for years, had quietly operated within the shadows of palace influence, while waiting for the monarchy's inevitable transition into a post-Charles era. The deeper William's legal team reportedly dug into the revisions, the more troubling the situation appeared to become. Because this was no longer about isolated wording buried inside constitutional documents. It was about power, long-term power, and according to palace whispers, several factions had already begun positioning themselves for the next reign, long before the public even realized a transition might be approaching. Insiders claim certain advisors favored a broader distribution of ceremonial and financial influence among secondary royal households once William becomes king. On paper, the proposals allegedly appeared subtle, almost harmless. Expanded advisory privileges here, increased ceremonial representation there, additional consultative authority attached to future succession councils. But according to sources familiar with the Duchy of Cornwall's internal standards, William viewed the revisions as institutionally dangerous precisely because of how quietly they could reshape the monarchy over time. One former palace insider allegedly described the strategy as soft restructuring through legal ambiguity, arguing that influence inside the monarchy rarely changes overnight. Instead, it expands gradually, hidden beneath protocol, tradition, and technical language until the balance of power begins shifting almost invisibly. That possibility reportedly terrified members of the old guard. Courtiers loyal to the traditional direct heir structure allegedly feared the amendments could die. Dilute the authority historically concentrated around the monarch and immediate successor. In private conversations, several insiders reportedly compared the situation to earlier royal periods where blurred lines of influence created dangerous instability inside the crown. And within palace walls, the fear was not merely symbolic. The monarchy survives on hierarchy, on clarity, on an unquestioned chain of constitutional legitimacy. Once uncertainty enters that structure, even quietly, the consequences can spread rapidly through every royal household connected to it. At the center of the growing anxiety was King Charles himself. Sources suggest his declining health unintentionally intensified what palace insiders now describe as a soft power struggle unfolding behind closed doors. Because while Charles remained sovereign, the reality of his physical vulnerability reportedly accelerated conversations many senior figures had hoped to delay for years. Competing factions allegedly began maneuvering around the future rather than the present. Some focused on preserving influence, others concentrated on protecting legacy, and a few, according to various interpretations from royal observers, appeared determined to secure their place inside the monarchy before William fully consolidates authority as heir apparent. That atmosphere reportedly poisoned relationships inside multiple palace offices. Staff members who had worked together for decades allegedly became guarded and suspicious. Loyalty itself became uncertain. Some aides were rumored to be aligning themselves with future power centers, while others doubled down on protecting the institutional framework established under Elizabeth II. Royal commentators close to palace culture described an environment increasingly consumed by paranoia, mistrust, and silent internal calculation. Every schedule adjustment raised questions. Every private meeting triggered speculation. Even routine constitutional discussions reportedly began, carrying political undertones. And through it all, William's position allegedly hardened. Insiders claim the future king became increasingly convinced that the monarchy faced not just external pressures from public scrutiny and media instability, but internal fragmentation from within its own walls. Rather than broadening his consultations, reports suggest William began narrowing them. He allegedly reduced access to sensitive discussions and started forming what some palace observers now describe as a far tighter internal circle, composed only of advisors he believed remained loyal to the crown's traditional structure. Catherine, according to several reports, remained one of the few stabilizing figures during this increasingly tense period, encouraging discipline while William focused on containment. But despite the growing tension, few inside the palace were prepared for what happened next. Because the moment William reportedly realized the amendments were part of something larger, that future king stopped treating the situation as a bureaucratic disagreement. Instead, according to insiders, he activated a countermeasure so serious that it immediately altered the balance of power behind palace walls forever. And everything changed the moment William invoked what insiders now call the heir's accord. Behind closed doors, Prince William reportedly launched a brutal constitutional counteroffensive, one that stunned even veteran palace aides accustomed to royal power struggles. The shift was immediate. According to insiders familiar with the palace's internal response, William stopped treating the controversy as a contained legal concern and began operating as though the monarchy itself had entered a state of institutional emergency. Within hours of invoking what sources now call the heir's accord, discussions surrounding the controversial amendments were allegedly suspended without warning. Meetings disappeared from schedules. Drafts under review were quietly frozen. Several advisors reportedly lost access to sensitive succession materials altogether. One former royal staff member later claimed the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace became cold and surgical, as though an invisible line had suddenly been drawn between those trusted to protect the crown and those now viewed with suspicion. Reports suggest William personally ordered emergency consultations with constitutional experts, senior private secretaries, and legal advisors connected to historic royal governance frameworks. The urgency of those meetings reportedly reflected one terrifying realization: the future king no longer believed the amendments were isolated proposals. He believed they represented the beginning of a broader attempt to influence royal authority during the monarchy's most fragile transition in decades. And according to palace whispers, that belief changed him almost overnight. Those closest to William allegedly noticed a dramatic shift in his demeanor. The Prince Long No. For measured diplomacy reportedly became intensely focused, emotionally distant, and relentlessly disciplined. Palace insiders later described him using words rarely associated with the future king before this crisis: cold, controlled, immovable. One source even compared his behavior to Princess Anne during periods of internal royal conflict, a figure famous inside palace circles for her unforgiving bureaucratic warfare style and unwavering loyalty to institutional continuity. The comparison was not accidental. Anne, according to long-standing royal observers, has always believed the monarchy survives only when sentiment is removed from moments of constitutional danger. And increasingly, insiders claim William appeared to embrace that same philosophy. At the center of the counteroffensive was the heir's accord itself. While no official acknowledgement of such a doctrine exists publicly, reports from administrative insiders describe it as an internal principle focused on protecting direct line continuity above all else. Under that approach, succession authority would remain tightly concentrated around the sovereign and immediate heir, minimizing opportunities for competing factions to accumulate informal influence during transitional periods. To traditionalists within the monarchy, the doctrine represented stability. To others, it reportedly signaled the beginning of a far more centralized future under William's eventual reign. Meanwhile, Catherine reportedly moved into an equally critical role behind the scenes. While William focused on constitutional containment, insiders suggest the Princess of Wales quietly worked to preserve public calm amid the growing tension. Sources claim she encouraged discipline among household staff and urged senior aides to avoid fueling speculation already spreading through royal media circles. Her role, according to palace observers, became less about politics and more about stability itself, because as rumors intensified around succession disputes and internal fractures, the Wales household reportedly understood one thing clearly: public confidence in the monarchy was beginning to wobble. Behind palace walls, the legal operation only expanded. Teams of constitutional advisors allegedly began reviewing every succession-related revision, directive, and procedural adjustment introduced since early 2024. Reports suggest even older contingency frameworks connected to regency planning and letters patent were pulled back under examination. Nothing was considered too minor. Nothing escaped scrutiny. At the same time, insiders claimed certain internal approvals were frozen indefinitely while access to highly sensitive royal communications became increasingly restricted. Some staff reportedly discovered their involvement in key discussions had quietly ended overnight without explanation. And yet, for all the discipline surrounding William's response, fear inside the institution only deepened. Royal commentators began describing a monarchy no longer merely preparing for transition, but actively defending itself from internal destabilization. Because beneath every legal review and every emergency consultation lurked a far darker question: what exactly had William discovered inside those amendments that justified such an aggressive constitutional crackdown? The answer, according to palace whispers, may have been even more explosive than anyone first imagined. Yet the greatest shock was still to come, because the rejected amendments may have contained provisions tied directly to royal authority after Charles's death. As news of William's rejection spread through royal circles, panic reportedly erupted behind palace walls. Some feared the monarchy was entering its most dangerous internal conflict since the abdication crisis. The sense of control the palace had fought so hard to maintain suddenly began slipping away. According to insiders, the moment whispers of the rejected amendments reached senior royal who, IC holds, a wave of fear moved through the institution with astonishing speed. Courtiers allegedly scrambled behind the scenes to contain leaks before details reached the wider press. Emergency calls were reportedly placed between private offices late into the night. Long-standing advisors who once operated with confidence now found themselves trapped in a climate of uncertainty where every conversation carried political consequences. One palace observer later described the atmosphere as constitutional panic wrapped in royal silence. What made the situation even more volatile was the growing suspicion that the amendments were only part of a much larger hidden framework still buried somewhere inside palace administration. Reports suggest several aides quietly feared additional clauses existed that William's team had not yet uncovered. And if true, that possibility threatened to turn an already explosive dispute into a full-scale institutional crisis. Because within the monarchy, secrecy is power. Whoever controls hidden structures often controls the future itself. As tension escalated, royal households reportedly began distancing themselves from the controversy with extraordinary caution. Certain advisors who had previously participated in succession discussions allegedly reduced their visibility almost overnight. Others quietly withdrew from internal conversations entirely. Palace insiders claimed some figures feared being associated with the revisions once William's opposition became undeniable. Loyalty inside royal circles, once carefully masked beneath etiquette and tradition, was now being openly tested. And according to reports from those familiar with the palace's internal culture, the divisions became deeply personal. Senior advisors allegedly engaged in tense exchanges behind closed doors as blame quietly spread through the institution. Some reportedly argued the amendments had been misunderstood and exaggerated by William's camp. Others insisted the future IC King had uncovered a dangerous constitutional overreach that threatened the stability of the crown itself. What terrified many longtime palace veterans was not simply the disagreement, but the scale of distrust now poisoning relationships inside the monarchy's highest levels. The palace had weathered scandals before: affairs, interviews, public outrage. But internal fractures surrounding succession planning represented something far more dangerous because they struck directly at the monarchy's foundation. At the center of it all stood King Charles. According to multiple palace whispers, the monarch had become emotionally and physically overwhelmed by the growing turmoil unfolding around him. Sources close to royal operations described a king exhausted not only by illness, but by the unbearable reality that his reign was becoming overshadowed by fears surrounding the future transition of power. Different interpretations of private meetings suggest Charles desperately wanted to avoid open ICI conflict inside the family while also recognizing the seriousness of William's concerns. But the deeper the crisis grew, the more impossible neutrality became. Meanwhile, Catherine reportedly shifted her attention toward protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis from the storm now surrounding the monarchy. Palace insiders claim the Princess of Wales became increasingly focused on shielding the children from media speculation and internal tension. Because as rumors intensified, so too did fears that the next generation of heirs could become trapped inside a growing constitutional battle they were far too young to understand. According to those familiar with the Wales household, Catherine viewed stability at home as essential while William remained consumed by the escalating institutional crisis beyond palace doors. Outside the palace, the pressure only intensified further. Media insiders later claimed journalists were quietly warned away from specific lines of inquiry tied to succession, by structures and internal legal reviews. Some reporters allegedly noticed unusual resistance when attempting to investigate palace staffing changes connected to the controversy. Others described a sudden wall of silence unlike anything they had encountered in years. And naturally, the secrecy fueled even greater speculation. Rumors spread rapidly through royal commentary circles that hidden provisions tied to post-Charles authority arrangements were still waiting to emerge. But instead of backing down, William reportedly hardened his position even further. Insiders claimed the future king became more determined than ever to defend what he believed was the constitutional continuity of the crown. To him, this was no longer about palace politics or internal rivalry. It was about preserving the monarchy from fragmentation during its most vulnerable chapter in generations. And in the middle of the storm, one haunting question began echoing through the palace corridors. Who tried to change the future of the crown, and why now? Even in death, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly still casts a long shadow over the monarchy, and according to insiders, William believes her final vision is now under attack. For more than 70 years, Elizabeth II represented something larger than politics, family conflict, or public popularity. To millions, she embodied permanence itself. But inside palace walls, those who worked closest to her often described another side of the late queen, an intensely strategic monarch obsessed with protecting the long-term survival of the crown. Reports suggest she spent decades quietly preparing constitutional safeguards designed to preserve stability through future crises, especially during periods of succession. Palace veterans now claim many of those frameworks were never merely ceremonial traditions. They were defensive structures built through experience, loss, and hard lessons learned from generations of royal instability. And according to insiders close to Liam, that is exactly why the future king allegedly reacted so fiercely to the secret amendments. He did not see them as political adjustments. He saw them as an assault on the final architecture his grandmother left behind. Within royal circles, there is an old phrase some former courtiers still whisper when discussing Elizabeth's influence over the monarchy. The power of the absent queen. Even after her death, insiders claim her philosophy continues shaping decisions behind closed doors. Her belief in constitutional discipline, restrained hierarchy, and unwavering continuity reportedly became deeply embedded within the monarchy's operational culture. Palace veterans now suggest William increasingly views himself not simply as heir to the throne, but as guardian of that legacy itself. To him, according to various interpretations from royal observers, protecting the crown means protecting the institutional blueprint Elizabeth spent a lifetime defending from fracture. And history, perhaps more than anything else, appears to haunt the current crisis. Royal historians have quietly drawn parallels between today's tensions and some of the monarchy's darkest succession conflicts. The abdication crisis of Edward VIII shattered public confidence in royal continuity. Earlier disputes surrounding George IV and Queen Victoria exposed how fragile the monarchy could become when family rivalries collided with constitutional uncertainty. Palace insiders understand those lessons intimately. That is why the current atmosphere reportedly feels so unsettling to many long-serving aides. Because behind the formal appearances and carefully measured public statements, some fear the monarchy may once again be entering a period where personal ambition and institutional survival are beginning to collide. At the heart of William's reported resistance lies a belief older than modern politics itself, that the monarchy is not a family enterprise to be divided according to influence or convenience, but a sacred institution held in trust across generations. Sources close to palace administration claim William repeatedly framed the issue not as a dispute over personalities, but as a matter of constitutional duty. In private, according to whispers from traditionalist circles, the future king allegedly argued that once the direct structure of succession becomes vulnerable to internal manipulation, the crown itself risks losing the clarity that gives it legitimacy. And increasingly, that argument appears to be gaining support among members of the old guard. Reports suggest several traditionalist courtiers who initially remained cautious during the controversy have now quietly aligned themselves more closely with William's position. Some allegedly see echoes of Queen Elizabeth's discipline in his response. Others reportedly believe the future king has become the only figure willing to confront the institutional dangers unfolding behind palace walls directly. What began as isolated, My essay support has slowly evolved into something more significant, a growing coalition determined to preserve what they view as the monarchy's constitutional core before the transition into William's eventual reign. Beside him throughout the storm stands Catherine. According to insiders, the Princess of Wales has become not only William's emotional anchor, but also the stabilizing figure increasingly reassuring both staff and public alike. Her calm approach during the crisis reportedly strengthened sympathy toward Wales' family at a moment when uncertainty surrounding the monarchy continues to grow. Public sentiment, royal commentators claim, has gradually shifted toward seeing William and Catherine not as participants in palace politics, but as protectors of continuity during a deeply fragile chapter in royal history. But behind that growing support lies a far darker reality. Because while William may be winning the battle for institutional control, the emotional burden of carrying the monarchy through crisis appears to be changing him in ways even his closest allies may not fully understand. And preserving the monarchy may come at a devastating personal cost for William himself. For those closest to the future king, the past few weeks reportedly revealed a side of Prince William the public rarely sees: furious, relentless, and deeply afraid of failing the crown. Behind the carefully controlled public appearances and measured royal composure, insiders claim the pressure surrounding the succession crisis has begun taking a profound emotional toll on William himself. Those familiar with the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace reportedly describe a man carrying the unbearable weight of two realities at once: a father watching his own family endure growing instability, and a future king increasingly convinced the institution he was born to protect may be entering one of its most dangerous transitions in generations. According to palace whispers, the constitutional battle over the amendments did not simply awaken William's political instincts. It awakened his deepest fears. Because for all the discussions about documents, succession frameworks, and royal authority, the crisis has always been shadowed by one devastating truth: King Charles's declining health continues accelerating the urgency surrounding everything. Reports suggest William understands more clearly than most that time inside the monarchy is no longer operating at a comfortable pace. Every constitutional review now feels heavier. Every disagreement carries greater consequence. Every delay risks creating openings for further instability. Palace insiders claim the future king has become consumed by the idea that if he fails to stabilize the institution before transition arrives, the damage could echo for decades beyond his reign itself. That burden, according to several sources, has changed the emotional atmosphere surrounding him completely. One longtime palace observer reportedly described William as operating without pause, moving from legal consultations to succession briefings to internal reviews with almost mechanical discipline. Yet beneath that focus, insiders suggest something far more human has been unfolding quietly behind palace walls: exhaustion, anxiety, isolation, the realization that duty to the crown increasingly demands sacrifices from him that no public role could ever fully explain. Through it all, Catherine reportedly remained the one constant source of stability inside the storm. Palace insiders claim the Princess of Wales became acutely aware of the emotional pressure William was carrying long before the public understood the scale of the crisis. While the future king immersed himself deeper into constitutional battles and institutional defense, Catherine allegedly focused on preserving emotional normality inside their family wherever possible. Because according to sources close to the household, George, Charlotte, and Louis now symbolize far more than simply the next royal generation. To William, they represent the fragile future of the monarchy itself. That reality reportedly intensified his determination even further. Insiders claim William became increasingly protective not only of succession structures, but of the long-term world his children would eventually inherit. The fear was no longer abstract. Palace commentators suggest he began viewing every constitutional threat through the lens of future stability for George as eventual king, for Charlotte and Louis as senior royals growing up inside an institution already under immense strain, and according to those closest to him, that emotional shift may explain why William's response to the amendments became so uncompromising. To him, protecting the crown had become inseparable from protecting his family's future. At the same time, reports suggest William's inner circle has shrunk dramatically during the crisis. Palace insiders claim the future king now trusts only a very small group of advisors and senior figures, many of whom share his belief that the monarchy must remain institutionally disciplined above all else. Some royal veterans have even begun comparing William's current mindset to Queen Elizabeth during periods of constitutional danger, a monarch famous for burying personal emotion beneath duty when stability demanded it. But those comparisons reportedly come with concern as well, because the emotional cost of that level of restraint can become devastating over time. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy quietly unfolding beneath the surface of the palace crisis. William reportedly understands that preserving the monarchy may require sacrificing parts of himself in the process. Personal peace, trust, emotional openness, even family harmony. Palace insiders suggest the future king has reached a point where preventing institutional chaos now outweighs nearly everything else around him. And as the palace falls silent once again, insiders believe this Mayatel may have permanently changed the future king forever. The secret amendments may have been rejected, but the war they exposed is far from over. Because beneath the ceremony, titles, and palace walls lies the real truth about monarchy. Power is never simply inherited, it is defended. In the weeks following the constitutional turmoil that shook palace corridors behind closed doors, one reality reportedly became impossible for the monarchy to ignore. Prince William had emerged from the crisis not merely as heir to the throne, but as the central defender of its future continuity. According to insiders, the future king's refusal to compromise on succession structures fundamentally altered how senior figures inside the institution now view him. For years, William had often been portrayed publicly as cautious, restrained, even reluctant to fully embrace the harsher mechanics of royal power. But the amendment battle reportedly changed that perception forever, because when the monarchy entered a moment of internal danger, William did not retreat from the pressure surrounding him. He stepped directly into it, and at the center of that transformation stood the heirs accord. Though never publicly acknowledged, palace commentators increasingly describe the doctrine as symbolic of a new royal era already beginning to take shape beneath King Charles's reign. According to sources close to royal administration, the accord represented more than a response to constitutional instability. It represented William's vision for how the monarchy must survive in the modern age through disciplined hierarchy, institutional clarity, and absolute protection of the direct line of succession. To supporters inside palace walls, it became a necessary firewall against fragmentation. To critics, it signaled a colder and more uncompromising monarchy emerging under the future king. Yet regardless of interpretation, one fact remained undeniable. William's influence inside the institution had grown dramatically. At the same time, reports suggest King Charles has increasingly stepped back from the center of operational decision-making as health concerns continue casting uncertainty over the future. While Charles remains sovereign, insiders claim many within palace structures already view William as the stabilizing force guiding the monarchy through its most fragile transition in decades. That shift reportedly created both relief and sadness within royal circles. Relief because the institution now appears to have a figure willing to defend it aggressively during crisis. Sadness because the transition feels accelerated by circumstances no family ever truly prepares for emotionally. Beside William stands Catherine, whose role throughout the turmoil reportedly elevated her standing inside both palace operations and public perception alike. Royal observers increasingly describe the Princess of Wales as the monarchy's future emotional anchor, a figure balancing discipline with calm reassurance. While tension continues building around succession. Sources suggest her quiet steadiness during the crisis strengthened confidence not only in William personally, but in the Wales family as the future center of royal stability itself. George, Charlotte, and Louis, meanwhile, came to symbolize something even larger in the public imagination. Continuity beyond conflict, a reminder that the monarchy's survival has always depended on its ability to carry itself forward through uncertainty, scandal, and generational change. Yet the crisis also left scars across palace factions that may never fully heal. According to insiders, the exposure of internal divisions weakened several competing circles of influence that once operated quietly behind royal protocol. Trust inside certain palace offices reportedly fractured permanently. Long-standing alliances became uncertain, and perhaps most importantly, the monarchy itself was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that Queen Elizabeth II rapport. I teedly understood better than anyone. Institutions survive only when duty outweighs personal ambition. That belief now defines William's emerging legacy more than any public speech or ceremonial appearance ever could. Palace veterans increasingly compare his actions during the amendment crisis to the late Queen's own approach during periods of constitutional danger, measured externally, relentless internally, and ultimately willing to sacrifice personal comfort for institutional survival. Because according to those closest to the crown, the monarchy has never truly survived on glamour, popularity, or even tradition alone. It survives through discipline, through hierarchy, through individuals willing to carry unbearable pressure so the institution itself can endure beyond them. And perhaps that is the final tragedy hidden beneath the grandeur of royal life. Every generation of the House of Windsor inherits not only privilege, but sacrifice, silence, isolation. The quiet understanding that, preserving the crown often demands surrendering parts of one's own humanity in the process. William reportedly understands that now more than ever, because in the House of Windsor, crowns are not protected by tradition alone, but by those willing to fight for the future of the throne in absolute silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.